I was in college when I accepted my call. And it's sort of like this image. People have been telling me since I was little that I should be a minister, but it wasn't until decades later that I finally accepted this call. And I imagine some of them thought they were going to watch that bobber forever. I went to college thinking I would be an engineer. My dream was to design cars, retire early on 1,000 acres. Because my second dream was farming. But even though my family lived in the same county for 160 years, we didn't accumulate anything but good memories and great relationships. And in the 80s, interest rates were incredible, so farming was off the table. And it really only took Purdue and I about one semester to agree that engineering was my hobby, not my vocation. They sent me home with a letter, in fact, telling me and my parents that one more semester like that, and I wasn't coming back. My parents loved telling the story that letter was then replaced a few semesters later with Dean's List as I turned things around because I accepted that call. Cried myself to sleep 3 nights in a row that year, which was rather embarrassing as a young man. Roommate across the room in his bed, and I'm in my bed weeping because life is just not working. And after 3 nights of crying, I finally accepted that this was never going to change unless I did something. And that was to pray. And being young and thinking I was very mature, my prayer was, "Dear God, people have been telling me since I was a kid I should be a minister, so I'll give it 1 year. And then we will reevaluate the situation." So I walked into our sister church there next to the Purdue campus, into the senior minister's office, and proudly announced, "I am called to be a minister, and I need to know how to do that." And he made that happen. He found a way for me to serve in his church and then go on to seminary. Well, as you can tell, after 1 year, there really wasn't much negotiating between God and I. Life had become such a joy. Not always easier, but such a joy to live. I remember after accepting my call, walking to class, and it was as if the trees were singing. Life had just become so vibrant and full of potential and abundance. It was a joy and has been ever since. But I imagine for some, they watched the bobber a long time for James to finally realize what God was calling James to do. Which is an encouragement to all of us to be aware and to watch, because Jesus is truly calling each of us to some ministry or ministries of some kind. Kevin was a member of a church I served in another place at another time, and he had a passion for the poor, a passion for service, and a passion for doing it as work projects. I mean, he thought it was great if we could write a check or donate something, but he wanted to see the difference being made. And he had a passion for refugees. So Kevin connected us with an institute in the local city that worked with the State Department to help resettle refugees. And we met with representatives from that institute, and they told us this tragic story of a family from Afghanistan who couldn't even bring all their family with them, but they could not stay in Afghanistan because it was too dangerous. And they gave us some ways in which we could be involved to help that family. It was so dangerous, in fact, that we were never told their name, and we weren't allowed to post pictures of them on social media to help protect them here in the States from reprisals. We prayed about this, and we worried over it, and finally decided to take on that portion of the resettlement where we provided the contents of their apartment. So for 2 months, we collected, everything you would need for an apartment, aside from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Bedding and furniture, groceries, cleaning supplies. There were children involved, so some toys for them. And then on the big appointed day, we rented a truck and drove to this apartment where we cleaned it and set up all the furniture and arranged it just for this family. It felt like we were giving them living water in a way. We were physically transforming their space so that when they arrived, it would feel like home, as close to home as we could make it. I think of this as a call to be fisher of people. I know most of my ministry, I've always zoned in on being called as fisher of people is all about that initial invitation to church, or that initial introduction of Jesus Christ, or that sharing of God's love for the first time with someone else. But remember verse 23? At the very end of what we read today, Jesus calls these disciples, these first disciples, and then the next thing he does to model being a fisher of people for them is he heals people. He goes into the crowd and he heals them of every disease. We see lots of healing stories in the Bible. And often I think of them as Jesus healing, the stuff that we all wrestle with, stuff that just happens. And I'm certain that was part of it, but beyond that, it was also healing them in the midst of their poverty. These were people ruled by the Roman Empire who left them with so little that they lived in squalor at times, and their diseases, their suffering, their sickness was born out of their condition, having to do manual labor without enough nutrients and sustenance. And so their sickness, in some ways, was brought on by their oppression. And Jesus healing them was physically demonstrating not just his power, but his love to change their life. I think about the time in which the stories we have of him healing people's children, or healing lepers, or blind people, or people that can't walk. He's physically transforming their life with his love. And when he calls us to be fishers of people, I think of Kevin and how he connected us to the resettlement of this refugee family so that we could transform their context, their life. The children that they brought and were going to raise, were going to have a different future. They were going to have a future. That is amazing. But I do believe that Jesus is about that initial invitation, that initial introduction. In another place, in another time, I was invited to go to the local jail to visit with someone's son. He was incarcerated, and I went and we had this conversation, and I prayed with him, and I honestly never saw him again. I don't know what impact that had on his life, but I know the impact it had on his mother's life, Connie, because she started coming to church, and she got excited about coming to church, and she listened, and she took it very seriously to the point that she went back to her workplace and invited her coworkers to come. Ultimately, 10 of her coworkers start coming to church. And so I remember the day that Connie and I were in the hallway, and we were talking, and I said, Connie, you know those people you invited? She goes, yeah, they're really excited about this church. I said, I know, they're going to join today. She goes, oh, that's great. I'm so glad that they're all going to join. I said, Connie, wouldn't it be great if you join with them? She had been one of our most talented evangelists in that church, and she hadn't even joined yet. So she comes up and she joins, and then she goes to our membership class with them. And I remember her first question, it was, so how long after Jesus did Moses show up? Yeah. I remember that question, not just because I was excited that we were reaching those who were unchurched and biblically illiterate. I was excited about that question because it demonstrated Connie's love for Jesus. She was just so excited about all this. She didn't worry about sounding less than smart. She didn't worry about what others would think of the question. She just asked it point blank. Fishers of people. Jesus called these 4 fishermen not because they're already saved or already practiced or already learned up. He called them because they were his own. And he knew that something inside of them could be shared with someone else in the name of the kingdom. And he knew that they could become fishers of people. And they did. You know, it's heroic to think about what those four and the other disciples did. They all end up giving their life for the faith. And they spread the faith to thousands and thousands of people all over the world. It's just amazing to think about their ministry and their willingness to go. I think about this story, you know, some of the things about this story that I usually ponder about are how quickly they left. I mean, that word immediately. They just dropped things and went. There was no like, well, let me go talk to my mom, or Dad, what do you think? Or let's weigh the pros and cons. They just dropped it and walked. But God's calling all of us. To me, this is a sign that God cares. God cares about what you do with your time and your giftedness and your relationships. That church that Connie and I shared together, it was all chairs. We had to set everything up. We didn't just set at the communion table. We were in a box, and we couldn't store anything in that box, so everything that we used for worship, we had to bring and set up. So we would always remind ourselves, even the setting up of those chairs is a God-called ministry, because without the chairs, the people of God don't worship well. They get tired of standing. It's a blessing to be called. It's a blessing to embrace it and to wrestle with it and to grow with it and to see the ways in which God is going to transform your life as you're transforming the lives around you. Amen.